Thomas Owens is a quadriplegic who can barely talk. He spends most of his days bedridden in a catatonic state. Yet one member of the Alabama Board of Pardons and Paroles recently voted the 34-year-old should remain in prison. And last year, the board denied parole to a man who had died 10 days before his hearing. These aren't anomalies either. In 2022, Alabama had one of the lowest parole rates in the nation at just 10%. Some of the people getting denied had charges for things like marijuana, decades-old burglary convictions, and plenty of them never hurt anyone. Meanwhile, our prisons remain overcrowded, understaffed, and under federal investigation with a looming trial for unconstitutional conditions. And yet, we let fewer and fewer people out of prison every year. As 4 non-blondes once asked, "What's going on?" Meet the 3-member parole board. Board chair Lee Gwatney, a former prosecutor.
I voted to deny parole.
Former state trooper Daryl Littleton.
Is this a different life than what you were doing when you were a young kid?
And former Bureau of Pardons and Paroles worker Gabrielle Simmons. Each is appointed by the governor for a 6-year term, and if you're a prisoner in Alabama, these 3 hold the key to your freedom. Although you're unlikely to get it. Parole hearings happen 3 days a week and they're open to the public, but there's no dramatic Hollywood moment. Actually, inmates in Alabama can't even come to their own parole hearings. Instead, those who support or oppose parole go, and they're allotted 2 minutes to speak to the board. Representatives from the Alabama Attorney General's office and a victims group called Vocal are there too. They usually speak in opposition to parole, even when a victim's family in a case supports release. In a matter of minutes, the board decides who gets a second chance. White men fare better than black men, and women do better overall, but no group does very well. If you're denied, you could have to wait up to 5 years to try again, if you're even allowed to try again before your sentence ends. But it hasn't always been like this. From 2015 to 2018, the parole rate was increasing, but then in 2019, the rate began to plummet. By the end of 2023, the board had paroled just 8% of inmates who had had a hearing. A few things happened about the same time the board decided to barely let anybody out. In 2017, a man named Jimmy O'Neal Spencer was paroled. Less than a year later, he killed 3 people. After his release on parole, he left a homeless shelter where he had been staying and went on a crime spree, ending with the murders of 2 women and a child. The board came under fire for their handling of the case, particularly from Alabama Governor Kay Ivey and Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall.
I personally knew these victims. There's no reason they shouldn't be alive today.
After that, in 2019, state lawmakers made some changes to the board and how it worked. They also allowed the governor more power in filling seats on the board. Groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center and state Democrats say that the legislation gave the governor too much power over the board's operations. After the former board chair resigned, Governor Ivey appointed a new chair, Lee Gwatney, in 2019. That's when parole rates dropped to historic lows. Before getting to the parole board, Gwatney worked as an assistant Alabama Attorney General. Since she got to the board, parole rates dropped another 21 percentage points by 2022. And they kept falling. In 2023, 81% of people up for parole met the board's guidelines. They only followed those guidelines 12% of the time. During parole hearings over the summer, Gwatney denied parole more than any other board member. She only voted for parole in 6 of the roughly 250 cases that came before her. Gwatney voted no in every case that her former employer, the AG's office, opposed. And 86% of people up for parole over the summer who were already on work release were denied parole. People in the prison system deemed safe to work in our communities every day. Gwatney's term ends in 2025. There are no term limits, and the group that sends nominations to the governor could rename her to their list. There was legislation to create oversight for the board, but the bill died last session when Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall wrote an opinion piece slamming it. Representative Chris England has pre-filed a bill for next session, aiming to require the parole board to follow its own guidelines. The Department of Justice is set to take Alabama to trial over prison conditions in November 2024, and if parole rates don't go up by then, it seems like more inmates could be watching that trial. For AL.com, I'm Ivana Harinkyu.